Money has always played a role in American politics, but over the last several decades, the rules governing campaign finance have changed dramatically. Supporters of campaign finance deregulation argue that spending money on politics is a form of protected speech and that voters benefit from hearing more voices in the political marketplace. Critics counter that deregulation has amplified the influence of wealthy donors and special interests, potentially undermining democratic accountability and public trust. To help us better understand these debates, I am pleased to welcome Professor Michael Kang of Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law. Professor Kang is one of the nation's leading scholars of the effects of election law and campaign finance on political parties and judicial elections. His research explores how legal rules shape democratic institutions and how those institutions in turn affect political representation and governance. Today, we'll focus on the broader implications of campaign finance deregulation for democratic governance. Hello, I am Marvin King, and this is Civic Lens. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
To help us get started, when political scientists and legal scholars talk about campaign finance, what exactly are we talking about?
In the United States, when we talk about campaign finance, it's a largely private system of fundraising to pay for candidates' campaign expenses. So candidates go out, they want to run for office, they go and talk to private citizens and try to raise money so that they can pay for the most part, a lot of this money goes toward campaign ads of various types. Today, it's not just radio and TV, it's also online and social media, but it requires a lot of money, increasingly so, to run for office. So campaign finance has become a really big part of who even chooses to run in the first place and how effectively they campaign and who ultimately wins. There's a few places where there's public financing, but largely in the United States, it's still a private fundraising model.
Many listeners have probably heard of Citizens United that really kind of opened the floodgates to additional monies in campaigns, but few are familiar with a case I think is really important, American Tradition Partnership versus Bullock. Would you mind briefly explaining how and why the state of Montana was trying to regulate campaign finance?
Yeah, so I think I agree with you that Citizens United was a pretty critical case in changing the way campaign financing runs. And I've written a fair amount about it. I think ultimately the big change that Citizens United did to campaign finance is really open the door to entities like super PACs that have really changed the game of campaign finance. What the state of Montana decided to do in the wake of Citizens United was try to open up a state-specific exception to Citizens United, essentially re-regulate the way that states and the federal government had regulated campaign finance before Citizens United. And the court shut it down. It wasn't entirely surprising that they would do that. The justices, I think, were very unhappy with the idea that you would have different sort of constitutional law of campaign finance for different states. Montana had a long history of being suspicious of corporate involvement in campaigns, given their sort of specific Western history with companies that came in and essentially ran the state and ran politics there. So they had argued that because of their special sort of history and culture, they should be effectively kind of exempted from Citizens United, which opened the door to corporate involvement in electioneering and ultimately things like super PACs. But the court rejected that. So it really kind of made sure from the court standpoint that Citizens United was going to stick, that there wouldn't be any sort of exceptions or ways that states could work their way around it, even if it was a state like Montana, which is a conservative state, but nonetheless had kind of anti-corporate campaign finance kind of politics.
And just to be clear, Montana in this instance was regulating state elections. This wasn't for federal elections. This was just for their own state House, state Senate, and the Supreme Court was still saying you can't impose these sorts of regulations?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So federal campaign finance law regulates federal elections for Congress, for president. State law, state campaign finance law, regulates state elections. Having said that, and that's what Montana was trying to do. They're trying to regulate their state elections, campaign finance in the state of Montana. But federal constitutional law applies to state and local elections. And that's what the Supreme Court was deciding, and how that applied to the state-specific Montana campaign finance regulation. So you have both kind of statutory regulations of campaign finance that are specific to elections, but the federal constitutional law applies to all elections, and that's where the Supreme Court, in cases like Citizens United, even though it's occurring at the federal level, really regulate effectively the state and local elections as well.
Supporters of campaign finance deregulation will argue that political spending is protected free speech under the First Amendment. What is the logic behind that argument that money is the same thing as speech?
Yeah, so this is a critical sort of move that the U.S. Supreme Court made in Buckley versus Vallejo, which really set the foundation for campaign finance law still even today. And in that case, the court decided that money spent in campaign finance has a speech component that's protected by the First Amendment. And what that means is the First Amendment's extremely protective of free speech. People have a right to free expression under the First Amendment. And what Buckley said was that the First Amendment therefore protects your ability to spend money in campaign finance. And your spending in campaign finance is First Amendment activity that the government can't freely regulate. So the government still regulates campaign finance, but it's highly restricted in the ways it can do that. Largely, it can restrict contributions of certain types. It can require disclosure of campaign finance activity, but the total amounts spent on campaign finance cannot be restricted. There are some restrictions on foreign entities, but when talking about domestic actors, individuals, groups, and now for the most part corporations and other sorts of business entities, they have largely a free right to spend.
On the other side of this, critics of essentially unrestricted spending will argue that this distorts democratic representation. What is the logic behind their arguments?
Their logic is that when you have no restrictions on the ability to spend in campaign finance, given that some people have more money than others, and we know today wealth inequality is quite large in the United States, that means that in practice, there are some people that are going to have just a much, much larger ability to affect elections. And because of that, candidates and lawmakers will pay a lot more attention to them, and their views will have a lot more traction in the lawmaking process. And there's a lot of political science research that suggests that that's exactly the world we live in today, that the very wealthy in particular, and this is increased with the removal of more restrictions on campaign finance activity, that the ultra wealthy have a lot of influence on the way politics work. And so even if we think that campaign finance activity is protected speech under the First Amendment, you have this kind of countervailing interest in equality that campaign finance regulation purports to serve. And so you have a kind of tension between those two values.
Most of the time when we're thinking of campaign finance, we're thinking about donations to president, executive branch, legislative branch. But your work also examines judicial elections, and we tend to think of judges as neutral arbiters. So, first, does campaign spending affect judicial races differently than legislative or executive elections?
So judges at the federal level are appointed. There's a kind of interesting increasing importance of money in that process, the federal appointment and confirmation process. Um, but that's very different than the election systems that a lot of states use. It varies from state to state, but I think in our own research, we estimate something like 9 out of 10 state judges at some point have to run for office or have to run an election to keep their office of some sort. Sometimes they're retention elections where it's just kind of an up or down. Sometimes they're competitive. Sometimes they're partisan. Sometimes they're nonpartisan. So there's a big variety. But a lot of judges, the short of it is, have to run for office and collect votes to either get their office or keep their office at the state level. And what that means is, as Justice Scalia once said, elections mean campaign finance. And so, in the absence of some sort of public financing system, judges as candidates have to raise money too. So, in a lot of ways, that means those races and the way that those candidates behave, often mirrors the way that legislative and executive candidates operate. They have to, in a lot of states, Texas, your home state of Texas, is notorious for this, that judges are particularly aggressive and raising money, in particular from lawyers who practice in front of them. And there are other states where you have a more of an appointment model, but where judges are elected, especially when they're partisan elections where spending is higher, they end up behaving a lot like candidates for other offices. And that's weird because we do think of judges as a little different than legislative office holders or executive office holders who are supposed to follow what the public wants at some level. That's the purpose of the elections. We don't necessarily want judges to act in exactly the same way. We want them to administer law and not be concerned with what majority opinion is. So there's a kind of oddity about judicial elections. That said, they're very popular. They're not going away. There's very few kind of political movements to get rid of judicial elections. There's a little less money spent in judicial elections. They're often not quite as competitive in terms of partisan mobilization, public awareness. So that has this weird effect, which is that sometimes the money matters more in those elections because there's less total spent. That if you come in with $5 million into a judicial race, sometimes that can be really important in a judicial race where it wouldn't be important in the governor's race or the Senate race. And what we're seeing is that donors are kind of understanding that the return on investment in judicial elections is quite good relative to other sorts of offices. And you're starting to see a real increase in the amount of money spent, particularly in state Supreme Court elections, partisan involvement in those elections, even when the office is nonpartisan, and a kind of growing politicization of those races in terms of connecting it with the party's agenda and big national issues that are not necessarily critical for state Supreme Court or state judicial offices. So that's a lot, but that sort of contextualizes where judicial elections fit in.
In terms of democratic governance, it seems that this is really all touching on the integrity of the system, knowing that people can trust that their judges will approach their cases objectively. So then I guess the issue is, does having to collect money from the bar or lawyers, I don't know who's going to donate to judicial races. I'm thinking that it's people who know the judges personally, friends and family, or people who might think they have business in front of the court.
Yeah, so a big part of the campaign finance donor class are lawyers. And we tend to think, my co-author Joanna Shepard and I, we tend to think that a lot of that giving is instrumental. It's less ideological. That a lot of lawyers, for instance, as I mentioned in Texas, have talked to lots of Texas judges and Texas lawyers who say, like you kind of have to pay to feel like you're going to get a fair chance in front of judges. And so the lawyer is not necessarily supporting by giving money to a judge because he thinks that the judge has the right ideological preferences, but feels like it's necessary so that he or she gets a fair shake in front of that judge. And that is a big part of who gives money to judges is lawyers. Business groups give a lot of money to judges, and a lot of times they want to get the right judges who are going to decide cases in a way that they like, that are going to help their business, that protect them from liability, have the right kind of views on regulation, whatever that is. And we have a lot of ideological giving. So whether that's issue groups or individuals, what we've seen certainly over the last 20 to 30 years is these judicial races have become more ideological, that the parties have gotten further apart, that judges are more ideological. They're less sort of moderates that sort of decide on the basis of some sort of objective law, but instead have a kind of stronger point of view about how judges should make decisions, how the law should be. And that really draws a lot of support. I mean, one thing in campaign finance, not just for judicial elections, is as the parties get further apart, the candidates are further apart, and there's a stronger choice you have to make between those. And we know that campaign finance donors, by and large, overall, are very ideologically motivated. That is a big part of why people give money, because they really care about how these office holders, whether judges or legislators or governors, they care how they decide things. And so what we're seeing is as the candidates get more extreme, the donors see a bigger spread between those. It's a bigger choice. The difference between one party controlling the office versus the other is larger, and you have a donor base that's become more ideological. So everything is getting supercharged in terms of ideology, and that's certainly bled over into these judicial races too. So it's not all instrumental. It's not all kind of rent-seeking behavior by businesses. You also have this kind of very powerful ideological component in judicial campaign finance as well.
So let me see if I can translate that into something that I've read about over the years. And geez, this sounds corny. When I first got interested in this, it may have come from a John Grisham book, but tort reform.
Yeah.
So when you talk about ideological, I could see as an example a chamber of commerce, a state chamber of commerce, thinking not about a specific company, not about a specific business, just in general, wanting tort reform. So therefore, they might support judges that they believe will be more inclined. I say that to preface my next question. A lot of folks might think campaign finance is a niche issue, but one reason why they might want to care about it is because this behavior is happening beneath the surface. And so the judges we have isn't organically natural. It's the result of groups who might be thinking, tort reform would be good for us, right? If we could reduce our liability, that might be good for us. Would that be a good way of looking at it?
Yeah, it just is basic logic that when a candidate gets a lot of money from some donor, that they're going to become more sympathetic to that donor's interests. And what we've looked at specifically is business groups and how much money they give to judicial candidates and how those judges make decisions once they're in office. And what we find is a really powerful relationship between those two. It doesn't mean that business groups, by giving money, kind of dominate all their decisions, that they never decide against businesses. But what we find is when we control for all the other things, the judges' ideology, other donors giving to them, the kind of condition of the law, strength of the merits of the different sides in the case, we find that the money matters, that it affects the way that judges make decisions. We study business groups in particular because they give a lot of money and their interests are clearly defined in the way that you sort of explained. But that's probably true for all kinds of groups, that it's not just business groups that can affect the way judges make decisions, but all kinds of groups that give money to judges. But business groups give a lot of money, and so it really does have an effect on the way that the law is shaped. And what we were interested in was, how does that happen? Is it that judges change the way they would have made decisions? That's kind of one story that we call biasing. A different story is all judges, they're going to kind of decide cases the way they think is right, but the money kind of affects who wins. And so when you have a lot of conservative money go in and elect conservative judges, the law becomes more conservative, right? And we were interested in our more recent book on deciding, what is the effect of money? How does it work? Is it because judges become biased toward the money that they've received? Or is it because the money is kind of controlling who gets office? And we find that it's really both. But actually, that this biasing story is true, that actually does account for a surprisingly large amount of why the law tends to map onto the donor's interests. That what seems to be happening is that judges know that they've gotten money from certain groups in the past or certain individuals. They know they will need money to get reelected in the future. And they bias their decision making kind of in that direction at the margin. And in our book, what we find is that when you remove the possibility of reelection, when judges don't have to worry about a reelection, they can't be reelected, a large part of the effective money disappears. And what that tells us is, like, this promise of reelection, the need to raise money for reelection matters. And that is a big part. It's not all of it, but it's a big part of the way that money affects the way that judges make decisions in office.
Before we close, I'd like to once again thank Professor Michael Kang of Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law for joining us today on Civic Lens. If you were asked to make a reform to the world of campaign finance in general or to judicial elections in particular, what reform would you think might be most useful?
Yeah. So there's a bunch of different reforms that scholars, good government groups have proposed, and they kind of run the gamut. It could be campaign finance, it could be public financing for judges, it could be to change the system of selecting judges altogether to something that's called like merit selection or gubernatorial appointment, all of which have their strengths and weaknesses. What we focused on for our purposes, given what our research sort of told us, is to be specific about how reelection affects judges. And so what we said in our book is, let's take reelection off the table, because it seems like that accounts for a big part of how money influences judges. It's not going to fix every problem in the world, but we think that it kind of removes effectively about a third to half of the effect of money in our research. And so if you want to keep elections, which most states do, most people do, they're very popular. And so that's not something that we're contemplating. If you're going to elect the judges, elect them to a single long term, and then don't give them the possibility of reelection. So once they're in office, they don't have to think about campaign finance anymore. They don't have to be influenced by financial considerations. And as far as the problem of money in judicial elections goes, we think that goes a long way toward helping solve the problem. And so that's the thing I would say.
In my classes, we often say that the number one goal for elected officials is reelection. That puts a primacy on campaign finance. This suggestion takes that off the table. And so then that solves a lot of downstream issues. This is from Free to Judge, The Power of Campaign Money in Judicial Elections, published in 2023. I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes. My final question is, I'm certainly going to encourage people to read Free to Judge. Do you have any other recommendations for people who are relatively new to learning about campaign finance?
I think judicial campaign finance is a little bit understudied in political science and even law. And so I can't say there's a huge literature on this. That's kind of good for us because we're kind of one of the few people that really study it at a sort of high level. One really critical resource in this area is the Brennan Center. So the Brennan Center has staff who are dedicated towards studying money, specifically in judicial elections, that spend a lot of time thinking about judicial reform. I think their website is the first place to start. I think our research is pretty good in this area. There's a bunch of different scholars, but I know Charles Gardner Jay, spelled Geyh, has recently written an article, The Brave New World of Judicial Elections, that tries to kind of summarize the state of research on judicial elections. And so that's another, I think, good place to start. He's a very good scholar who's studied judicial elections for a really long time. And so there are lots of sort of citations within that article that I think collect, the scholarship and the literature in a way that's also a good place to start.
I'll include all those in the show notes. Those are great starting points. Once again, Professor Michael Kang from Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.